Lunchless lunch in the lecture, but I am told lunch is on its way.
Yes.
We didn't just sort of sucker punch you in here to, and I know you're not here for the lunch, you're here for the lecture, but lunch should be on its way, and we'll get that all sorted out. In the meantime, let me introduce my colleague, Professor Nadif Shahrani, who is Professor of Near Eastern Languages and Cultures of Central Eurasian Studies and Anthropology, former chair of the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Cultures, and former director of the predecessor of the Center for the Study of the Middle East, which is the Middle East and Islamic Studies program. A wonderful colleague and a dear friend. Please welcome Dr. Nadif Shahrani.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Faisal Isravadi, of course our current director of Center for the Study of Middle East, a founding director I should say. And he's very kind. Normally he does these kinds of introductions, so he has passed it on to me this time to introduce our guest. Let me thank all of you for coming here and being with us. This program has been funded and supported by a number of units. The head, of course, is Center for the Study of Middle East. And Jenny, who is not here, I think, looking after lunch, has done most of the legwork, and I appreciate that effort. Also, supporter of this event is Department of International Studies. The director is here with us, I appreciate that too. Also, Inter-Asian Uralic National Resource Center has been supporting this particular event today. The last one, but not least, is Pan-Asia Institute, who is paying for our lunch, if it shows up. So, thank you so much for coming here. It's really a great pleasure to welcome and introduce a colleague, a young scholar. The war in Afghanistan has done a lot of things which are not very good, but one of the things that it has attracted is many young scholars who have been actually doing research in Afghanistan in the last 15, 16 years. And the new crop is now really beginning to fill the positions in academia, in research institutions, and otherwise. And Dr. Naysan Adlparvar is one of them. I met him just a few months ago, actually, at Yale University, and was very much impressed by what he has done. And he is born and bred in England, of a mixed parentage, I should say, an Iranian father and English mother. He has also gotten his undergraduate degree from University of Reed, and has done his master's degree at Durham University, and has earned his PhD from University of Sussex in their development studies program with very intensive focus on anthropology or political anthropology. He has also, given the fact that he's working on development studies, he has gotten his own hands dirty in doing actual development work, which is something that we often don't do. I was very much interested personally in development kinds of programs and projects, but never had much of a chance to do anything with it. Whereas Naysan has actually done many years of work in development with UNDP. In particular, he has worked in Afghanistan, in Jordan, in Iraq, and is very much interested also on relationship really between fragile or failing states and their communities, their societies. The talk that he's going to be giving here today is about a particularly oppressed ethnic group in Afghanistan. Some of you may know the Hazaras, and he has spent quite a bit of time in Bamyan, has produced his own dissertation on the research he did in Bamyan, and he will be sharing with us essentially what has been the impact of the last 16, 17 years of war in Afghanistan on this particular ethnic group in the country, which, as we'll be hearing, has actually benefited tremendously compared to some of the other ethnic groups in the country. So let's welcome Dr. Adlparvar and let him talk instead of me. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming, and thanks.
That's a very gracious introduction, thank you very much. And I think you set up a number of the topics quite well that I hope to speak about. In the title of the presentation, there's this phrase I've used, levelling the playing field. And essentially what I'm going to do today is tell you a story about the political reconstruction process in Afghanistan, the impacts that's had at local levels, in Bamyan Valley in particular. But it's not just a positive story. It's not just a story of changing inequalities and shifting power relations. It's a much more complex picture, which is what I'm trying to capture in my research and in what I'll talk about. It's also very timely. You painted me as a very successful academic, but you also mentioned I'm very early in my career, which is true. And I think this is very timely. It's very nice to be here today, because I'm in the process now of starting, probably in the coming weeks, to turn what I'm talking about now from my thesis into a book and a series of journal articles. So I'm here with a very kind of open heart, open mind. I'm encouraging any comments, anything that stands out to you, anything you'd like to see more of, anything you challenge or contest as well, and that will really help me craft where I'm going and moving forward with my writing. Before I move on, just to say thank you very much to Ambassador Strawadi, to the Centre, to Professor Shahrani, to Jenny, and to all of the institutions that support me here. So thank you very much, it's a real pleasure. Okay. You'll notice on the first few slides as well, I've taken a lot of photographs of Bamyan to try and help people get into the mindset of the environment, the people, and the sort of work that I was doing. And also probably because people tend to get bored after about 5 minutes of me speaking, just to keep things kind of focused. This is essentially how I'm going to structure the presentation today, just to give you an idea of the direction. We're in this first section now giving a bit of an overview and orientation, but I'm going to talk a little bit more about the historical formation of ethnicity in Bamyan. I'm trying not to go too deeply, but there's a couple of themes there that are relevant to what's happening now in Bamyan. So I want to show what was happening then, because it sets the foundations for the process of change we're talking about. I'll then talk about what happened after 2001 with the political reconstruction process, how that became very politicized. And then from that launching point, because some literature has already addressed that, from that launching point really get into what's happening in Bamyan at local levels in terms of the changing status of the Hazara community and their relationships with other members of other ethnic categories in the valley. And then at the end I'll talk a little bit more about some of the manifestations of that changing relationship and just explore some of my case studies, and then I'll get to the tentative conclusions, some broad ideas, and again invite your comments on those conclusions. Again, just before I get into the content, this is a photograph of the Provincial Reconstruction team in the background in Bamyan Valley. In the foreground you can see this is the airstrip, and this is actually the airport in Bamyan, that container, those two containers there. And you'll start to see from some of the photographs to build up an image of the valley itself. As Professor Shahrani accurately said, the Hazara are known to be an extremely marginalized and oppressed community in Afghanistan, going back for a very long period of time, and particularly from the late 19th century with the establishment of the Afghan state under Abdurrahman Khan. But when I first arrived in Bamyan, I actually went there prior to my fieldwork to do some work for the UN, but when I first arrived there on the ground and started to speak to people about basic ideas around identity and ethnicity, something struck me very strongly. And that was that the Hazara community were in ascendance. They were in a much more confident position, at least in the Bamyan Valley. They were involved in a lot of different sectors, economically, politically. There was a sense of rising confidence, and there was changing dynamics with other communities in the valley. If you look at the literature, this isn't what's articulated. It's a very classic discussion of oppression, which is definitely the case. So I immediately felt that I needed to tell the story about what happens after 2001 and why it's happening as well. There are a number of articles which point at this shifting kind of dynamic, but nobody really unpacks it in great detail. But why do I think this research is value beyond that point? There's a few things that I'm kind of putting out there where I think there's added value. And I'll miss the first bullet point here before, but I'll come back to it. But essentially it's talking about this changing dynamic on the ground, but it's also contributing, hopefully, I think, a very valuable empirical account of what's taking place in Afghanistan post-2001. There are, again, as Professor Shahrani mentioned, a number of scholars who have done PhDs in the country who are now coming to publish books and taking up posts. There's two or three in particular that I think that have done detailed anthropological work. But really there's a dearth of this sort of work. A couple of books, again yours and a few others I can think that over the 16, 17 years preceding 2001 that actually got down to this level of analysis, a valuable, deep kind of reading of Afghan society. I'm also trying to look at the prospects for national integration, the impact of the introduction of constitutional democracy in Afghanistan, also the particular way that patronage networks have impacted that introduction of democracy, but also to talk about what happens at local levels again, because that's not something that's done largely in the literature, which is more political science in terms of positioning. And I think, from kind of with my practitioner or policy hat on, one of the things I'm also thinking about is understanding the emerging tensions on the ground, why that's happening, and also to an extent talking about what can be done about it. So I hope these things can come through. The first bullet point you'll see up there also, I'm trying to, or I have adopted and will be talking about and writing about a slightly, say, more contemporary reading of ethnicity as well. And a lot of the literature in other contexts, but also in Afghanistan, there's a lot of discussion of ethnic groups, a lot of discussion about ethno-nationalism and political dynamics at the national level in governments, etc. What I've tried to do is take, drawing from Roger's Brubaker work in the most recent incident, who's based at UCLA, to look at his idea of everyday ethnicity, or ethnic categories. Now this is not something that's unique to the literature on ethnicity, but it's something that's largely not been addressed, or not been utilised in the case of Afghanistan in the literature. And essentially what this does is, rather than saying that ethnicity is found in ethnic groups, it's out there in some sort of social reality, is saying that ethnic categories are ways that we look at the world and the ways that we organise it in our minds. So it's a conceptual category, and it's also a discursive resource that's used in discussion to legitimise standpoints, to undermine standpoints, and that can range from political discussions to everyday discussions, which is a lot of the things I try and capture in the case studies when I'm actually writing. I don't want to dwell on that too much, so I want to get into the real meat of the discussion. And just finally to say that this is based on around 12 to 14 months of fieldwork conducted over 2 years between 2010 and 2012, and did constitute my PhD, which I did at the University of Sussex. So I'm assuming that not everybody knows Afghanistan in the room, so forgive me those of you who do, just to give a little bit of a brief introduction. A map of Afghanistan here, and you can see in red this Bamyan is the area that I'm looking at. Kabul relatively close by. And just in terms of, to give a little idea of geography, we're looking at the main spine of the mountains that run through Afghanistan, with Bamyan sitting right nestled in those mountains. It's a very inhospitable place with long winters. It is in certain senses a political backwater in terms of the eyes of Kabul, but also sits at the centre of what is now, or has been for some time, the Hazarajat, which is the ostensible homeland of the Hazara peoples. Actually, just before I do move on, there are two routes to Bamyan from Kabul, both of which I've driven before 2008 when it became impossible to do so. It's also worth mentioning that the districts and provinces that surround Bamyan are, in most cases, populated by the Pashtun and Tajik communities, which in many ways are the antithesis of the Hazara community, and I'll explain more about why that's the case in a moment. So there's a real sense of being trapped or being surrounded by very hostile peoples or communities, who are, in the eyes of the Hazaras and probably quite accurately, sympathetic to the Taliban as well. I don't want to get into detailed accounts of all of the kind of the ethnic markers that determine these different communities, but essentially I'm looking at three main communities in Bamiyan. The first are the Hazaras, which, as I mentioned, originating from this region, the Hazarajat region. They speak Hazaragi, which is a dialect of Persian, spoken in Afghanistan. They are a Shia community, and importantly, they have a Mongol phenotype. So a racial characteristic which would be similar to, or is linked to the Mongol hordes coming from the north, which is ostensibly one of the origins of the Hazara people. But also makes them able for them to be singled out very clearly in terms of to be targeted by government, to be targeted by other communities, which is a very particular feature of the Hazara. And racially, with the establishment of the Afghan state, which I'll mention in a moment, was a way of singling them with very low status, very low caste in the growing capitalist system in Afghanistan in the late 19th century. They are a minority, a sizable minority in the country, but a majority in Bamyan. And there's something I want to stress here in the sense that what I'm talking about in Bamyan, because of the representing a majority, the shift in status is happening much more rapidly than I would argue at the national level. And there are other scholars of Afghanistan who, I wouldn't say take offence, but have concerns about pushing an agenda which talks about the Hazara community becoming empowered. Some of them are Hazara intellectuals themselves, because they don't like me challenging the idea of a long-pressed community in Afghanistan, because that, as you'll see, forms the real basis of their identity. And there are also those from opposing ethnic communities, Pashtuns, particularly Tajiks to a lesser extent, that also feel a sense of disempowerment by the dynamics taking place in Afghanistan and are particularly concerned about discussions like this. So it's a very politically sensitive topic as well that I'm talking about today. But I digress slightly. The Tajik community, which are a Dari-speaking and non-tribalized, which seems a strange way to categorize a group, but this is largely in reference to the Pashtun community, which is seen as a much more tribal community, but also a Sunni community. And I'll talk a little bit later on in some of my case studies about the sectarian tensions and how they're continuing to emerge in the context of Bamiyan. And finally, there is the Said community. Now, the Said community represent a particularly interesting social category in Bamiyan, Afghanistan as a whole. Largely in the literature, they have been treated as almost like a religious caste within the Hazara community. And one of the things I'm arguing is, because of the differentiation that's taking place, and I'll talk about the details in a moment, but actually there's a need to designate them as a separate ethnic community in Afghanistan. And over the past few months, there is cross-sectarian alignments taking place within the Said community to register themselves as a political party in terms of making claims on the state and asserting themselves more strongly in Afghanistan. So there's a dynamic emerging there which I will talk about as well. And they claim their descendancy from the Prophet through the Aylid line, through Imam Ali. And the way that they maintain this line of descendancy, which is really key to their identity, is through the line of the oldest male, but also by always maintaining marriage inside the community. So Said women always marrying Said men to maintain this line of pure patrilineal descent. And again, I'm going to talk about how that's changing and being challenged in the case of the Bamyan Valley. But before I give you all these juicy details, I just want to familiarise you a little bit with the valley and the kind of environment in which I did my field work. This is an excerpt from a map. The pink area is the lowland, I don't know if you can see it actually, but this area is the lowland agricultural zone in the middle between the two sets of mountains on both sides. All of these white dots represent villages essentially. So Bamiyan largely is a collection of villages, with obviously a long history of interrelations. You have the airstrip we saw a picture of before, beyond which was the Provincial Reconstruction team in the mountains in the background on this side. And the two Buddha niches that I'm sure you're familiar with that were destroyed The Buddhas in the niches destroyed in 2001 by the Taliban shortly before the ousting of their regime. This is a photograph taken from one of the remaining viewing booths, which would have been at the eye level of the larger Buddha in Bamyan. So looking back across the valley, this is taken in April time when it's at its greenest. And you can see here, these are some of the villages in the valley, with the administrative centre set on the plateau, the airstrip, and behind there would have been the PRT you saw earlier, with the photograph of the mountains. So this is primarily where I did my work in a number of these communities. And here's some photographs of some of the locations, some of the individuals that I worked with. So just to give a overarching picture of the formation of ethnicity in Bamyan. In the late 1890s, Bamyan sat between Tsarist Russia to the north and the British Empire in India to the southeast. And it was at this time, with these two great empires coming together, that Afghanistan was essentially created as a buffer state. This was done with a lot of support from the British, as they have a tendency to do, to provide financing to Abdul-Rahman Khan, the king of Kabul at the time. And the emir then set about pacifying a lot of these outlying areas, Afghan, Turkestan, and the Hazarajat also being one of the major areas. And I think 1891 to 1893 were the Hazara Wars, in which, using a combination of British financing and weapons, but also relying on Sunni loyalties against the heretic Shia Hazaras, very aggressively pacified this region. And I'll talk about the impact of that in just a moment. But at this time, prior to the inclusion of the Hazarajat into what was becoming the Afghan state, there was a tribal system authority maintained at the time between the Mirs, the large-scale landowners, and the Dakhan, the agricultural labour, so kind of a bonded system at the time. And there was also the support of the Piran, the saints, so religious leadership, let's say, in these communities. And there was some intermarriage in terms of political relationships between the Sadat, which were primarily the saints at that time, in which they would take, as a second wife, they would take one of the daughters of the Mir to maintain some sort of relationship and this kind of working political leadership to control the Bamyan Valley and more broadly the Hazarajat at the time. And again, I will talk about how that system, which for a very long period of time was in place, is now being challenged. So I'm just setting up for a later comment, so I'll ask you just to hold on before we get to that. So we have this widespread pacification of the Hazarajat, very violent pacification of the Hazarajat. A huge displacement of Hazaras into Mashhad in Iran, into Quetta in Pakistan. The execution and elimination of the local leadership, the peers and so that the Mirs and the peers, the political and religious leadership at the time. We have the enslavement of tens of thousands of Hazaras, particularly women, which were given as trophies to those that had conquered the valley, but also taken into Kabul, as I mentioned earlier, into the kind of growing capitalist system, to become labourers at the very bottom level of what was taking place in the economy in Kabul. Also, that very verdant land we saw in the earlier photograph, if I can just go back to it. A lot of this very verdant land was awarded to the Tajik and Pashtun soldiers and officers that, tribesmen I should say, that were utilised by Abdul-Rahman Khan for the occupation of these areas. So they gained Hazara slaves to work the lands, female slaves in their households, given lots of land to settle into these areas. And as we were talking about yesterday, a lot of this was about an expansionist idea to push Pashtuns, Tajiks who were sympathetic to the king into these northern areas to set up a state to maintain control in these areas. also what happened was with the elimination of this leadership at local levels, the Sayyid community rose to become interlocutors between the new Afghan state authorities and the communities in place. So they really solidified their control and superior status in Hazara communities. We also saw a breakdown in the tribal relations, which were very common at that time, but positioning against a common enemy led to ethnicity becoming increasingly important, to sectarian affiliation becoming increasingly important at this time. So let's just skip forward a 100 years, if you give me that privilege. Following the US invasion of Afghanistan in 2001, a number of steps were undertaken, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, which started with the Bonn Agreement and then various transitional authorities before the constitution of the Afghan state was put in place in the manifestation that we now see. Alongside the introduction of the advent of democracy, which was enshrined in the constitution, was also, I was going to say implicit, not so implicit, power sharing arrangement between the different ethnic communities in Afghanistan, which was at the top level recognised in the installation of a Pashtun president, but a number of vice presidents from different ethnic communities. And essentially what started to happen was that ethnicity, although previously very important in terms of political dynamics, became enshrined as the modus operandi, or the formalised way that the Afghan state started to function. So drawing on the patronage networks of these vice presidents from different communities, allocating their ministries, allocating funds to those ministries in different orders depending on how important that ethnic community was, which cascaded right down into areas like Bamyan and had tangible effects. So this politicisation of ethnicity has been documented by Conrad Schetter and others. And again, I take this as a staging point to look at what happens at local level. Also, we saw very much with the behaviour of Karzai, particularly with Khalili, his Hazara vice president at the time, Karzai appealing to these ethnic communities in exchange for the assumption of votes in the next round of presidential elections, on repayment for those votes in further rounds. So the allocation of resources, development resources, based on them supporting his leadership. And what has that led to? As I mentioned earlier, these patronage networks trickle down into these communities. In Bamiyan in particular, one thing we saw was the first Hazara governor appointed in Bamiyan. Muhammad Rahim Aliyar came in post at a time when Hazaras were also being allocated, and he was instrumental in this process, in allocating many political appointments at the provincial level and district level to Hazaras. So pushing aside Tajiks that largely under the Taliban had benefited from consolidating control over land and political positions. It pushed aside Sayyids, Sadat, who were particularly in Yakolan, a neighbouring district, but also in Bamyan, in a very strong position politically. And this allowed a number of other processes to take place. One of them was a shift in control of the marketplace in Bamyan, which had started prior to 2001, but the marketplace, exclusively owned by Tajiks, was destroyed in a lot of the fighting during the civil war period. So we were left with a destroyed marketplace, which was then renovated by the local Hazara-dominated government. Those plots were then sold off to largely Hazaras in the community, so a new economic standing. Interprovincial trade, which largely was in the hands of Tajiks before this time, because they had the connections on the other side, outside of Bamyan, is increasingly being taken over, and this was largely in terms of poplar wood, apples and potatoes, Bamyan's white gold, as it's called. So you start to see Hazaras assuming a lot more of those businesses, taking and trading potatoes, apples outside into Kabul, into Mazar in the north. We also saw, under the leadership of some militias in Bamyan, the reclamation of a lot of the land that we saw and talked about earlier. So properties and land in some of these areas being reclaimed on the grounds that it was taken from So a general shift in terms of some of the political and economic fields in Bamyan. Checking I've covered all my points. And a very crucial one as well is the social gains. With the establishment of a number of schools and the introduction of coeducation, a lot of young Hazaras, some returning from outside, from Iran primarily, but also from Pakistan, returning to receive education, access to health services. It's probably also worth mentioning, it's not something I focus on here, but it is, I think, also quite important, is the return of almost 10,000 very well-educated Hazaras from Iran, from Mashhad and elsewhere, into the Bamyan Valley, which at the time was around 11% of the population. So 10% of the population suddenly being extremely educated with a very strong sense of national awareness coming back into Bamyan. And this also had an effect in terms of education, in terms of organization, etc. at local levels. Which is actually the first point on this slide. So really what I'm arguing based on, and I go into much more detail in terms of examples, case studies and figures in my research, what I'm arguing is this shift of or access to productive and economic resources and social resources has resulted in a very changing standpoint for Hazaras. Not only are they now recognized in terms of the constitution to be able to practice their religious rights, they're also now a very potent political force in terms of elections and the need to capture their votes. They also have much better educational standing and a renewed sense of confidence and purpose, I would argue. And this changing standpoint has translated into the challenging of old inequalities in relation to the Sadat community and the Tajik community, which, as you can imagine, has also resulted in increasing tensions and increasing violence. I believe I've still got time. I wanted to talk about two particular case studies that really outline these two shifting dynamics. And there's a very third large case study that I draw on, which I won't talk about today, which is looking at the emergence of class relations in Bamyan as a result of the growing economy and the growing standing points of members of the Hazara community, and the way that that is being justified in terms of entitlements and contestation of other members of the Hazara community. For example, those coming back from Pakistan are seen to be less Hazara because they speak Quetagi, which is, or they're accused of speaking Quetagi, which is a mix of Urdu, English, and Hazaragi, which, you know, people say it's terrible, they're not really Hazaras, and there's lots of similar claims which are made to undermine that kind of legitimacy to claim what's taking place. But not to dwell on that. I want to talk about Humaira and Jalil, who are a couple. Humaira is a Sayyid from a family of good standing in Bamyan, and Jalil is the son of I would say, he's not a poor family, but a mediocre family, a Hazara in Bamyan Center. They went to the University of Bamyan together, which now has a burgeoning set of courses and students, and they met in the classroom, they developed a relationship, they maintained that relationship through mobile phone contact, under the radar of their parents, and they decided they wanted to spend some time together, they wanted to get married. And there was an initial approach to Humaira's father, who categorically said it's not acceptable because as a Sayyid lady, she would be marrying a Sayyid man, and that would be the deal. He'd already had some plans with other families to build a political relationship. So with the help of the Independent Human Rights Commission, which is backed by the UN, they escaped to Kabul and were married by a sympathetic mullah in Kabul, and on the grounds that she had the freedom to choose the partner. Humaira's father, upon finding out that she'd eloped to Kabul, obviously he got very upset. He mobilized a large number of
senior powerful Sayyids in the community, and saying that this was not just to him in terms of his honor and the family, but a direct attack on Sayyid identity in terms of the idea that she could not marry a Hazara because it was so important to maintain this idea of pure descent within the Sayyid community. Jalil's father was arrested through a few backhand deals, put in prison for a few weeks, and the Human Rights Commission agreed to bring them back from Kabul to meet with the family for her to explain the circumstances that she wanted to maintain this relationship. So in the Human Rights Commission, happening just around the time I'd arrived, Humaira sat down with Jalil, her father and two brothers, and clearly in a state of advanced pregnancy explained that she was married and was having Jalil's child. The family were obviously extremely upset. It undermined their argument that she'd been kidnapped and taken away. They stormed out, and Humaira and Jalil were leaving to go back to Kabul to travel the following day. They never reached even the gates of the Human Rights Commission. One of her brothers attacked her, stabbing her in the stomach, trying to kill the child, trying to kill her. There was intervention by police officers that are stationed there. He was detained, she was rushed to the hospital. The second brother threw a chair from the outside through the hospital window, climbing through, trying to finish what his brother had started in the hospital. He was also detained. The good news is that both mother and child survived. Both of the brothers were detained, and this was something that was, as you can imagine, very heavily documented in the press, in the local press in Bamyan. And it's a number of incidents of similar stories taking place, in which often, at least 50-60% of the time, the Hazara boy is found with his hands strapped, shot, or left in the desert to die. Probably in 30 or 40% of cases, the Sayyid daughter will also have been killed, or taken back to a community and very rapidly married off to a member of the Sayyid community. And what I'm arguing here is very much that with the rising sense of status and confidence in the Hazara community, that whether it's intentionally individuals sitting down, I don't think is the case, but a general sense that why can't we marry Sayyid women? There's nothing religiously that dictates it's the case, it's a cultural practice, because of historically the Sayyid community having a superior role as interlocutors, as descendants of the Prophet, as very kind of charismatic, high-status individuals. And this was articulated to me time and time again. In fact, in one case, I was working with two research assistants, both Sayyid men, one from Bamyan and one from outside in Ghazni. In Ghazni, this practice broke down 1 or 2 decades ago, and I wish I could talk to more why that's the case. But they were working together, and I remember having a discussion when I was explaining to them why I was doing this line of interview. And what ensued was a 30-minute heated debate between the gentleman from Ghazni saying, this is totally fine. You know, one of my cousins is married to a Hazara, and this is the situation. It's just normal, and this is about progress. The other from Bamyan getting extremely angry with his friend and colleague and appealing to me to tell me that this is the case and these are the reasons. So this is really something that's happening currently with great animosity and tensions in Bamyan as we speak. It's a real prevailing sort of process of social change, which is why I've tried to capture it. And it's not documented anywhere else as far as I can tell. Nor even, to a large extent, is the breakdown of the relationship between the Hazara and the Sayyid community, except in some of the literature looking at the emergence of Hezbi Wahdat and some of the parties post-79 with the Soviet invasion. So there's a story to be told there. And I think there's also a very clear story about the intervention of the UN, the Human Rights Committee, the language of, or the discourse of human rights and the way it's being utilized to support this process of change. The second dynamic I'd like to talk about is the changing dynamic between the Hazara and Tajik communities, or in the case of Bamyan, the Shia and Sunni communities. And as I mentioned earlier, with the introduction of the 2004 Constitution, for the second time, for the first main time in terms of a constitutional document, in terms of national law, Jafari jurisprudence, Shia religious practices and interpretation were recognized in the Constitution. So from this time, there's been an increasing prevalence in the expression of mourning rituals in the month of Muharram, particularly Ashura, which was politicized so effectively by Ayatollah Khomeini in 1979 in Iran, and is currently, to some extent, also being backed by Iran in Bamyan. And this practice, it's a very intense process to watch for those of you who haven't seen or participated. It involves a sinazana'i, so a lamentation, a rhythmic striking of the chest, in a sense, lamenting the death of Imam Hussein in 680 CE on the plains of Karbala at the hands of the Sunni Caliphate at the time, which is often brought up as the origin of the schism between Sunnis and Shias. While I'm not contradicting that, what I'm arguing here is the politicization of that idea, which is taking place, has been taking place for some time in the region, but particularly now with the practice of Ashura post-2004 in Afghanistan and in Bamyan. I attended some of the morning ceremonies and Ashura when I was there, and it was very interesting because there was two religious scholars in presence. One of them was a Hazara MP, who was also a religious scholar, who was talking through, reciting the what took place at that time and making parallels to the current situation. And the second was an Iranian religious scholar who'd come specifically for the purpose of this ceremony. I happened to have a meeting with the governor the following day in which I was telling her about this experience. And when I mentioned that there was an Iranian scholar in attendance, she suddenly stopped the conversation, pulled in some members of her security to find out how this person had got in, why they were here, because obviously at the time she was doing her best to minimize the Iranian extension of Iranian soft power into the university and into kind of a lot of these religious processes. But what took place during that ceremony? Well, essentially, Baba Ali Mazari, who was a figurehead of the Hazara resistance, killed by the Taliban when he was thrown from a helicopter after they invaded Kabul and captured him. He is a real figurehead of the kind of political movements of the Hazara. And Imam Hussein, as with this recitation of the process, Imam Hussein is compared, or I should say Ali Mazari is compared to Imam Hussein as being killed at the hands of the Sunni Caliphate, the current Sunni Afghan state. That's the way it's framed. But this isn't new, this is something that's been documented by other scholars in Pakistan and elsewhere. What was new in this case was the Iranian scholar who then stepped forward and continuing this line of lamentation and the kind of deep emotional kind of terms of this discussion, then started to say it wasn't just the Afghan Sunni state that was a problem, but their Zionist backers, the US. And he then started to make linkages to the death of Muslims in Palestine, the death of Muslims, particularly Shia Muslims in Iraq, to kind of try to build up this kind of pan-Shia ideology almost in terms of the process that was being discussed. Why am I talking about this? Well, one, because it's feeding very strongly, I would argue, into the tensions between the Hazara and Tajik communities in Bamyan, but also because it sits right at the core of this idea of Hazara identity and Shia identity in terms of a oppressed, marginalized community. I'm not arguing that they're not oppressed and not marginalized. It's again about the way that it's being deployed increasingly in Bamyan because of the way the state is operating on an increasingly ethnic basis. And there's a whole host of other case studies I talk about in different public settings. And I'm getting a little conscious of time now, so I'm not going to go too great into depth, but I'm happy to talk about them, in which you'll see religious and political leadership not associated with the government from the Hazara community. For example, in Nowruz, the March 21st celebration of the New Year, in which this idea is immediately deployed in front of everyone, the idea about being oppressed at the hands of the state. There'll be references made to Imam Hussein, there'll be references made to the continuing oppression for over 1600 years at the hands of the Sunni community. And then there will be this claim against the state, which always seems to come through, that the state has to do something to protect us. The state has to do something to give us greater developmental resources to build and protect ourselves. And it's a continuing trope that's seen in many different ways, which really reflects the kind of political, social nature of ethnic identity in Bamyan. There are a huge number of other things I'd like to talk about, but I think what I might do is just shift to the conclusions and summarize some of those so that I've got time to get some feedback and comments from you. Yeah, so I started, and the title, talking about leveling the playing field and the idea of introducing democracy as something that will undermine inequalities, that will provide opportunities in the very simplest forms to marginalized communities. So in a certain sense, there is definitely a positive impact, as you mentioned at the beginning, in terms of a shifting, a recognition of the Hazara community and access to resources at subnational levels, but also to an extent at national levels, which is leveling the playing field. But it's a much more complex picture, I think. Because not only has this leveling of the playing field and the recognition of ethnicity in Afghanistan changed the rules of the game, as it were, in terms of the way the Afghan government operates. It's the rules of the game, as it were, in terms of the way the Afghan government operates. It's really entrenched that way of operation. And it's further, I would argue, perhaps not on a national scale of violence, as we've seen previously in Afghanistan, but it's definitely feeding into growing sense of tensions and politicization of ethnicity. And I will argue will continue to do unless there's some way of looking at the state structures or the incentives that's leading to this politicization. I would argue as well, and this is not particularly new in terms of looking at development studies and process social change, but the introduction of democracy in such settings is obviously an inherently violent process as well, because it's about redressing inequalities and some of the examples that I've talked about. And this, of course, is very much the case in Iraq, which is somewhere else I've worked and starting to study as well. And as I put here, those with the most to lose resist change, and in Bamiyan this resistance is often violent, and I'm thinking more about the Sadat community, but there's no reason we couldn't see this with a growing destabilization and a growing decline of security in Afghanistan between the Hazara and Tajik communities as well. The last 2 points. There's an argument here, and I'm not sure to what level I should be taking it, given that it's primarily a policy or pragmatic one, that there's a need to recognize that these processes are taking place at the national level and the micro level in Afghanistan, and to understand that it's not just about how we're badly exporting an idea of democracy and letting it take hold and doing elections to withdraw and to say democracy has happened. We all know this, but to look at the kind of ripple effects to also manage that process, because in cases of Afghanistan, Iraq and elsewhere, the introduction itself, I would argue, can lead to the tearing apart of social fabrics and actually do much more damage than is expected, or even the positive, undermine the positive impacts that are expected. And largely, I think there's two other areas. As I said earlier, empirically, I hope this account is valuable. The case studies are valuable to scholars and people working in Afghanistan. But on a theoretical level, and this is not something new to anthropologists, but there's a methodological argument for looking at micro-level interactions through ethnographic data collection using Rogers Brubaker's idea of ethnic categories. It allows us to, again, what I haven't covered here, a whole chapter which looks at the way that conversations unfold, the way that the idea of being more or less Hazara is used to justify certain ideas or undermine other ideas. As I mentioned earlier, the way that this is deployed in terms of accessing or making claims on economic resources in Bamyan. And I think it opens up, not that this hasn't been done by others in Afghanistan, but it opens up and drives the need to think much more carefully about this level of analysis. And I would even argue, to go one step further, almost to look at psychoethnographies, but let's say psychological anthropology, to look at the ways that people experience ethnicity on an individual basis and the way they jostle with the individual and social expectations placed upon them to perform in certain ways or to challenge ideas. There's a number of cases in which I'm talking about Hazara friends of mine and the way they challenge the ideas of what it means to be a Hazara. And now, for example, we're seeing a rise or a space being created by Sunni Hazaras
which is something that would never have even been conceptualized. There have been those Hazaras that identified as Sunni in small numbers previously, but it's not something that was commonly accepted. Now trying to carve a niche for themselves in Afghanistan, largely on a social level, but to an extent a political level as well. So there are these dynamics taking place in this kind of increasingly plural environment. And I shall leave it there. I'm sure there's lots of comments, critiques and ideas which I really welcome, open to, because I think it will help me present better, write better in the future. Thank you very much.
Perhaps during the question and answer session, people can sort of slowly, a few people at a time, get up and get lunch. I'm very sorry, obviously the restaurant delivered lunch late. I apologize for that. Marvelous talk, but let's open it up to question and answer, and please let people, especially those who need to leave by 1:30, please say something. And I'll leave it to you to call.
Would you like to take the question, or should I take the questions?
You can take them.
Great. Well, I will start right here because your hand went up first.
I do not have a lot of critics on this back, so I would like to ask, like a short few years ago, 80,000 people from Hazaras lived in Kabul. That was the second majority after Khalid's Kabul. And also the Shia you said in the central area, I think that we have more than them Sunni Hazara all around that area. Yeah, I have met Mr. Mazari. Actually, I do agree he was a very brilliant person. He asked me to write an article about the ethnicity of Hazaras. I already did, and he approved that Hazaras are not Mongol, they are Turks. And also, some minority of the Hazaras are Ismailia, Kailan area. The last one I'm talking to you is just, there are several books that probably we haven't seen them, and Mr. Hussain Ali Yazdani, he wrote 3 books, very good, the best research, and he proved that Hazaras are, and Professor Shahrastani also wrote a book, and also Gezavi wrote a book, and one other Russian man that wrote a book, but by Hazara was translated, I forgot the name. Something like that, and I did write a book about the ethnicity of Afghani people. Some people just suggested to write. I already wrote a big part and a big chapter about Hazaras. And I wish that, it was a very good lecture. I learned a lot and reminded me a lot, I have a lot of information about this. Thank you for very good.
Thank you very much for your comment. The first thing is I would like to get that book and the work you've done from you. Obviously, that's very
my book has been published by Hazaras 5-6 times at Kabul. I don't. Maybe I'll try to email you.
Yeah, I'd love to get a copy. I think just to respond, if I may, because I'm going to try and avoid taking too many questions and getting overwhelmed. I did some work with the Ismaili community at the time. In fact, the photographs I showed you actually of the Ismaili community in some of the more distant parts of Bamyan. But I guess for brevity and to try and focus my research, I focus on these major dynamics because I think they're the most prevalent. But I recognise that there's the Sunni Hazara community I didn't really engage with to a great extent because the areas they were in were less secure, and also because of the security processes put in place by the university that prevented it. Thank you very much for your comment.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. I enjoyed the talk. It's kind of follow-up of what the gentleman said. I have heard and read that actually weren't the Pashtun more violent to Hazara compared to the Tajiks? And again, along the question that he asked, from what I read and heard is that actually Pashtuns are extremely nationalist in compared to Tajiks. One of the reasons that they have created this atrocity was not only they are Shia, the second one is that they have Turks coming from Central Asia. And that's the question that he was raising. I think these are the last thing to, Pashtun to say, they were Turkicized, they are not, the way that they look at the Turks. That's one question. And the second one is that did really the fact that Islamic Republic took place in Iran and Shiism was spreading, whether that played a role, whether the Afghans, not the Hazaras, they thought that Iran is going to influence the spread of Shiism in Afghanistan.
You're asking if that's the case, or is it a comment?
Pardon me?
You're asking if that's
No, I'm
the case?
asking a question whether that's it.
It's interesting, both of those comments. I'm very careful as an anthropologist first. I'm very careful as a non-Afghan also to not make claims about which is right and which is wrong. I mean, clearly there is evidence which suggests the atrocities that took place, but I'm not necessarily trying to take a standpoint. I guess what I'm more interested in is exactly what you just said, is the way that these things are deployed politically by people to argue for or against. This discussion, for example, about the Mongol versus Turkic elements is something that's used to, and it happens both ways, used to justify the Hazaras were here or were not here first, therefore they cannot claim residence in this area, whether the Hazarajat does or does not really exist, all these sorts of kind of dimensions. And it's that thing that I find so fascinating. So I've come across some of those debates around the kind of Mongol or Turkic origins. Thanks for drawing my attention to it, and I guess it's something that I need to also think about more carefully. In terms of the kind of Iranian influence, I mean, Iran did, and still to some extent does, we did very heavily, different arms of the Iranian regime supporting different political factions in the Central Highlands region of Afghanistan. 7 different Mujahideen groups, militias that were formed by 7 or 6 different entities within the Iranian government during the Civil War period, which then, as they realized that they were uncoordinated and losing out through kind of discussions about the reorganization of the state, then came to 6 of those groups came together in Hezb Baghdad, which has since actually fractured to some extent. But so definitely they've been involved previously. At the current time, one of the things that was very clear from talking to the government and other senior level politicians in Bamyan was that there's a real sense of Iranian soft power trying to infiltrate Bamyan. The main entry point being, well, the 2 main entry points, one being the university that I mentioned earlier, in terms of them sponsoring libraries, very particular selections of books, presenting a very political interpretation of Islam. You see also a lot of Iranian students being offered Hazara students in Bamyan being fully paid trips to Iran to go on pilgrimage of different types, to engage with them, to impact their thinking, to bring them more to an Iranian standpoint, let's say, and then also in terms of assuring a lot of the political nature, a lot of the kind of religious rites that are taking place there. I mean, this is something that David Edwards has written about more than, I think, 20 years ago, perhaps, talking about the Ashura and the way it was taking place in Afghanistan, but now it's at a different level because of the accepted public nature.